The evening arrived with a quietness that felt almost intentional, as though the universe had conspired to keep everything calm and undisturbed, just for them. And Sarah recognized this the moment she entered the study, where Marcus had already prepared everything with care. The leather armchair positioned just so, a vintage reading lamp casting warm light across worn pages. Hold on just a moment before we continue. If this story is touching something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference and helps me bring you more stories like this one. I also want to hear from you. Write in the comments, where are you right now? Are you tucked away in a peaceful village where stars fill the sky? Or surrounded by the hum and glow of a city that never sleeps? A documentary paused on the tablet screen, a ceramic mug of tea steaming gently on the side table, and it all seemed so ordinary that it nearly concealed the deeper current flowing beneath the surface. Because this was never simply an evening of companionship. Even though neither of them spoke it aloud, it represented another entry in a lengthy catalog of shared moments that never quite crossed into something more, yet always danced along its edge. And Sarah settled into the chair with deliberate care, maintaining the familiar distance between them that had become their unspoken custom through the years, a gap that proclaimed friendship on the surface, but held something far more complicated underneath, something patient. Something that sometimes brought her ache in ways she didn't fully understand. And as the documentary began and soft music filled the room, her concentration kept wandering, catching on small particulars like the way Marcus paid such close attention during important scenes, or how his laugh emerged quietly when something brought him joy. And she found herself wondering, as she had so many times before, how someone could feel both incredibly near and impossibly distant at once. Because their connection ran deep, years of shared meals, whispered conversations, midnight discussions that stretched longer than either expected. But certain territories remained unmapped. Certain feelings remained unnamed. And tonight, that understanding felt sharper somehow, more present. And Sarah pulled the throw blanket higher around her shoulders, not from cold, but because she needed something tangible to ground herself while her mind spiraled faster than the images on screen. And she kept repeating to herself that this night was like all the others, that she was letting her imagination run wild again, that Marcus was simply someone who cared deeply and nothing beyond that. Yet something in her core resisted this narrative, because her deeper self had learned to read the spaces between moments, how Marcus's shoulder angled close enough that she could sense his warmth without making contact, how neither of them retreated when their arms brushed, how the silence between scenes stretched unusually long. And as the documentary continued, Sarah became aware of a peculiar sensation. A tender pressure building in her chest, not sadness exactly, but a consciousness that something significant was approaching, something just beyond her ability to perceive. And she glanced toward the window where the curtains billowed softly as wind moved through the night, and the world beyond looked deeper than before. The streetlights glowing like distant sentries, and she wondered if walls held the memories of the hearts that moved within them, if moments like this accumulated silently inside a person until a single small event caused them all to overflow. And then without preparation, without ceremony, without any sound at all, the world went dark. The screen dying instantly, the warm glow disappearing as though someone had closed a heavy door, and the entire room dissolved into shadow. Not a peaceful darkness, but the jarring kind that made every sound sharper and every thought more insistent. And the documentary halted mid-scene, cutting off the narrator's voice and the accompanying score as if a switch had been thrown. And for a handful of seconds, neither of them made a sound. And in that pause, Sarah's breathing caught because the absence of light removed something critical, the comfort of distraction and routine. And now there existed only the room itself, the oppressive quiet, and Marcus sitting beside her, somehow closer now in a way that could not be dismissed or minimized. And she heard him shift his weight, felt the cushion beneath them move, and her entire body sharpened with awareness because instinct understood before thought did that this singular moment mattered in ways she couldn't yet articulate. And her pulse quickened, not from anxiety, but from a sudden understanding, because when darkness arrived, everything contracted, and all the feelings they had carefully kept at a distance suddenly moved into stark clarity, demanding recognition. And Sarah realized that regardless of what occurred next, this night would transform into something different entirely, because the darkness had appeared at precisely the moment when every suppressed emotion was ready to emerge into consciousness. The darkness settled around them like a living thing, sudden and all-consuming. And for several moments, Both Sarah and Marcus remained perfectly still, their breathing becoming the loudest sound in the compressed space. A rhythm that seemed to echo in the absence of other noise. And the lack of illumination made the room contract, made it seem as though the walls had drawn closer specifically to hold them together, and Sarah became conscious of every detail she had previously managed to ignore. The steady rise and fall of Marcus's torso, the faint brush of his sleeve against her arm, the subtle scent of his cologne, something she had always found comforting, but which now carried an intimacy she had never fully acknowledged, even to herself. And Marcus reached for his phone in automatic response. The familiar glow that usually promised reassurance was absent, the battery completely depleted, abandoning them to the dark. And yet that absence of a technological escape made everything feel more concentrated, more weighted with significance. And he finally spoke, his voice measured and soft, not attempting to fill the void but acknowledging its weight. "Seems like the power's out," he said simply. And Sarah nodded, her throat constricted, her thoughts accelerating with recognitions she had previously suppressed. The ordinary statement somehow grounded her yet made everything feel unstable, because everything familiar had suddenly become fragile and acute. And she found herself wanting to respond with more depth, to articulate her inner reality. But instead she swallowed the words, selecting composure over vulnerability. And they remained there together, the darkness functioning as both barrier and sanctuary, the external world suspended. And Sarah's heartbeat intensified with a strange combination of apprehension and anticipation, because the darkness seemed to activate confession, even when words remained unspoken. And she ultimately whispered, "This is kind of wonderful," surprising herself with the admission's honesty. And Marcus turned in her direction, his interest evident even though she could only sense it through the darkness. "Wonderful?" he asked, his voice carrying surprise and curiosity, and she elaborated, "Peaceful. Like everything outside has paused, and nothing else matters but this room, this moment." And he seemed to smile, a small private expression that transformed his features. And the darkness made it possible to notice subtleties normally hidden, to acknowledge the closeness they had always carefully avoided. And in that silence, Sarah's innermost self became conscious of how much she had neglected, how profoundly she longed for a bond that transcended simple friendship, how years of deliberate distance had started to feel like walls she finally wanted to dismantle. And Marcus's presence transformed from merely comforting into something magnetic, drawing her consciousness into territories she had deemed too risky to explore. And she found herself wondering if he experienced it too, this unspoken transition, this recognition of something delicate and profound moving through the night, the subtle pull of intimacy that wasn't physical, but was absolutely undeniable. And she understood that in the darkness, everything they had successfully hidden from one another became nearly impossible to keep contained, because absence of light made the heart articulate more clearly than speech ever could. And Sarah's mind tumbled as she recognized how simple companionship had gradually metamorphosed into something greater, something fragile and exciting. And she noticed how each small sound, the settling of the chair, the movement of fabric, the distant hum of wind outside, carried weight and intention, as though the entire environment was leaning closer to observe. And she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, an internal heat generated entirely by closeness and shared history. And Marcus's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts once more, delicate and uncertain, yet brimming with something she couldn't entirely name. "I understand what you mean," he said. And in that simple acknowledgement, a bridge materialized, a connection that had existed for years but had never been openly recognized. And in the shadows, Sarah felt their relationship's boundaries blur just slightly. The years of careful boundaries ready to shift into something authentic, something genuine, because the dark had taken away distractions and made them genuinely present in a way daylight never permitted. And each glance, each small movement felt magnified, significant, charged with unspoken possibility. And she understood that the documentary, the tea, the entire planned evening no longer held significance, because they had become participants in something far more consequential than entertainment. They were inhabiting their own narrative. A story constructed from quiet tension, longing, and feelings neither had dared to voice. And the exterior world might have sustained its familiar patterns. But inside this room, inside this darkness, time seemed to move differently, perception sharpened, and Sarah sensed a delicate electricity, a feeling that something important waited at the threshold, prepared to transform everything. And she wondered for the first time in such a long time whether Marcus experienced the same pull, the same unacknowledged yearning, the same deep wish to move toward one another. and the room appeared to hold its breath alongside her. The darkness forming a canvas where emotions could exist without judgment, without words, without obligation. And yet every single second expanded like an eternity, saturated with tension and quiet assurance. Because in this darkness, the distance between them compressed, and Sarah felt closer to him than ever before, a closeness that transcended physical proximity, penetrating deeper into shared history, into longing, into the careful awareness of hearts that understood each other. And she recognized that she didn't want the lights to return. Not right now, because the darkness had exposed yearnings that might never surface under ordinary circumstances, yearnings that spoke of potential, of possibility, of affection waiting patiently beneath years of friendship. And as they both occupied the darkness together, breathing in synchronization, the night seemed alive with potential energy. And Sarah comprehended, in a way that language could never fully capture, that this unscheduled moment, this sudden blackout had shifted something fundamental, had brought forward emotions they had each carried alone for far too long. And in that silence, in that darkness, they had transcended simple friendship. They had become two individuals standing at the precipice of something entirely new, something delicate and unmapped. And her heart, once careful and guarded, now beat in readiness for whatever might come next. The next word, the next movement, the next truth waiting beneath the surface. The minutes stretched long and strange in the darkness, filled with words that never quite took shape, but hovered between them like fragile glass. And each small sound, the gentle creak as one of them shifted, the soft rustle of fabric, even the faint wind outside, seemed loaded with meaning, as though the very room held its breath alongside them. And then Marcus's voice broke through the thickness, low and tentative, almost fragile. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" And her heart leaped, a mixture of excitement and trepidation flooding through her as she replied carefully, "Yes." "Go ahead." Uncertain what he might express, yet prepared for it somehow, because even a small question now felt enormous with significance. And he leaned forward slightly in the darkness, though she could merely sense it through the intensity of the moment, the darkness transforming proximity into something deeply intimate without requiring physical touch. And his words emerged gradually, each one deliberate and considered. "Have you ever felt like you missed a crucial moment with someone?" And her chest squeezed because she understood precisely what he was indicating, though she had never imagined he would speak it aloud. And she admitted in a soft voice, nearly trembling, "Yes, more times than I can count. But especially," and she halted there, unable to finish the sentence but hoping he comprehended its implication. And he waited, letting her confession settle between them, then continued, "I keep thinking about that. About how we might have missed something." His tone carried a weight she could perceive more intensely than hear, and Sarah recognized that this night, this unexpected blackout, had stripped away the protective layers they had wrapped themselves in for years, revealing nothing but genuine connection. And within that stillness, she felt an intense desire to eliminate the distance, to communicate, to finally speak the words she had kept locked away for so long. But she held herself back, fearing the potential damage to the comfortable foundation of trust they had spent years constructing. And yet the words themselves, now spoken into the darkness, transformed everything, establishing an invisible connection between them, a delicate acknowledgement that their relationship had fundamentally altered. That feelings once hidden were now permitted to exist, even if only through silence. And the darkness made it possible to recognize the subtle signals, the way his breath caught, the manner his hand rested nearer than necessary, the gentleness that radiated from his presence, delicate yet undeniable. And Sarah's consciousness raced as she considered all the moments they had experienced together, all the quiet glances, the lingering laughter, the extended conversations deep in the night that had shaped who they both had become. And she comprehended now that those years had been groundwork, that the companionship had been essential to support what was now becoming possible. And when she whispered, "Do you think it's too late to step forward, I mean?" She felt her own fragility in those words, the tender tremor showing the hope and anxiety coiled together in her chest. And Marcus's response emerged slowly, deliberately, overflowing with the kind of authenticity that had always drawn her in completely. "I don't believe it is. Not unless we decide it is." And within those words she felt vast territories of meaning, a commitment, a potential. And in the darkness the room seemed to condense further, enclosing them in a bubble where time lost its typical progression, where years of careful restraint could no longer contain the magnitude of feeling that had constructed itself steadily and quietly. And Sarah's consciousness tumbled with recollections of every small action that had once appeared routine, but now revealed itself as intimate, significant, a quiet vocabulary of affection neither had acknowledged but both had internalized. And in the weighted silence that succeeded, the atmosphere itself seemed heavier, electric with unspoken emotion, brimming with the unvoiced declaration hovering at the threshold of articulation. And she understood that apprehension and hope were moving together. Each heartbeat amplified, each breath a signal of longing and restraint simultaneously. And she wanted to articulate everything at once, to tell him the complete landscape of her feelings. But she comprehended that words might fail to hold the delicate perfection of the moment, might disrupt the equilibrium. So she remained quiet, allowing him to sense the depth of her presence, permitting the darkness to give them residence in this suspended reality where anything seemed attainable. And Marcus's breathing changed subtly, a sign of his own awareness, his own anticipation. And in the space separating them, Sarah felt a current of connection, a profound recognition that they were positioned on the border of something exquisite and frightening, something tender that demanded bravery to investigate. And the darkness had taken away all the ordinary protections, all the typical boundaries created by light and visibility, leaving nothing except honesty, emotion, and potential energy. And she registered how each small gesture, his hand brushing the fabric of the blanket, the angle of his head, the quiet breath between moments, communicated with more force than any spoken declaration. These gestures articulated years of collective memory, care, longing, and feelings too complicated to name. And she sensed the rush of recognition that they were no longer merely companions in routine, no longer simply two individuals occupying the same location, but participants in a delicate instant of awareness, a tender awakening of feelings that had existed for far too long in obscurity, patient and persistent. And in that instant, she wished the darkness would hold them indefinitely, that the external world would vanish completely, departing only this room, this closeness, this mutual awareness. And she experienced a thrill of risk, not in anything physical, but in the emotional vulnerability of admitting to herself that her soul had desired this for years, that it hungered for him in a manner that could not be reversed or forgotten. And Marcus's voice, when he spoke once more, was gentle, hushed, yet absolutely steady. "I'm afraid sometimes," he admitted, "afraid that if I speak what I'm feeling, I'll destroy this." And Sarah's breath caught, because this vulnerability matched her own internal struggle, and she found herself speaking before doubt could stop her. What if speaking it is the only way to keep it? And the question hung between them, enormous and undeniable. And she felt both terror and courage intertwining as she added, "What if staying silent destroys us instead?" And Marcus reached out then, his hand finding hers in the darkness with certainty, as though he had always known exactly where she would be. And their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that felt monumental, revolutionary, like crossing a threshold they could never return from. And Sarah felt tears gathering because the contact, that single connection, meant that the boundary between friendship and something greater had finally dissolved. And Marcus's voice emerged, trembling slightly with emotion. "I don't want to lose you," he said, "but I'm more frightened of losing what this could become." And Sarah squeezed his hand, communicating what her voice could not entirely express. "You won't lose me," she promised. "You could never." And they remained like that, hands connected in the darkness, hearts communicating in rhythms deeper than language. And Sarah understood that this single evening, this temporary blackout, had shifted them both irrevocably, that the story of them had entered territory they could never completely retreat from. The lights returned unexpectedly, reactivating in a gradual sequence, flickering initially like hesitant stars before settling into consistent brightness. And Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and reluctance as the darkness that had held them so completely evaporated, restoring the room to ordinary appearance. The documentary screen flickering to life again, reminding them of the external world and its relentless continuation. And for a moment, both remained completely still, fully aware that everything articulated and felt during the blackout could not be erased. Even though illumination had restored normalcy, the invisible bonds between them had transformed, become more substantial, more real. And Marcus turned to her directly, his eyes meeting hers completely for the first time that evening. The distance between them on the furniture unchanged, yet the invisible geography between their hearts had collapsed entirely. And in that regard, Sarah perceived the expression of her own apprehension and faith, a tender recognition that this evening had awakened something within them both, something delicate and lasting. And he spoke quietly, almost cautiously, as though testing the solidity of everything that had transpired. "I'm grateful the power failed. And she smiled, her mouth curving with a quiet delight that contained both humor and genuine emotion. "So am I," she replied, allowing the truth of those words to settle in her chest. And the documentary held no further significance. The tea had gone completely cold, because this particular night had presented them something far more precious than any entertainment could offer. An instant of complete honesty, of emotional transparency, of a bond that neither could dismiss or minimize. And though they did not physically move nearer, did not reach across the space to touch, the distance separating them no longer functioned as an obstacle, but as a line waiting patiently to be crossed when the circumstances aligned perfectly. A line now softened by comprehension and acknowledgement, and their hearts articulated what their lips had not yet entirely voiced. Every pulse a tender confirmation of the tension, the longing, the possibility that had awakened in the shadows. And when Marcus eventually rose to leave, he moved with deliberate caution, a small hesitation at the threshold that felt heavier than any simple goodbye. And Sarah sensed the gravitational pull of things unspoken, confessions hovering between them like clouds prepared to release rain. And he looked backward, his eyes lingering in a way that conveyed everything words could not. A smile emerged, faint but absolutely genuine, and he said, "We should finish that documentary sometime." His words contained both a proposal and a commitment, a suggestion that this evening represented merely the opening rather than the conclusion, that what had commenced in darkness could continue to develop in illumination. And Sarah nodded, her internal landscape flooding with anticipation and gentle nervousness. "I would really like that," she replied, and when the door closed, the sound reverberated more loudly than it should have, a period marking the evening's quiet transformation. And the room, now fully illuminated by electric light, maintained its ordinary character, yet carried the weight of everything that had transpired in the shadows. A memory they both possessed, though they had not articulated all of it in conventional language. A moment that would persist, tender and insistent, in Sarah's awareness, causing her pulse to quicken in ways that exceeded her ability to completely articulate. Because the darkness had demolished barriers, had enabled genuine connection, had rendered the subtle emotions they had long concealed impossible to continue denying. And she recognized that the return of electricity did not erase the interior transformation, that the connection was no longer dormant, but animated and alive, a gentle, unwavering presence awaiting the appropriate moment to grow and flourish. And the quietness that remained after Marcus departed was saturated with introspection, anticipation, and the bittersweet sensation of feelings newly awakened, the kind that possessed the potential to restructure everything without requiring a single word to seal the change. And she returned to the furniture, the blanket still around her shoulders, and perceived the room from a fundamentally different perspective, warmer, more intimate, brimming with the recollection of closeness that had been momentary but absolutely transformative. And she comprehended that the blackout, that sudden absence of light, represented a gift, an opportunity to perceive one another, to sense one another's presence, without the ordinary barriers and defensive mechanisms. And she recognized that the authentic narrative of the evening was not the documentary, not the cooling tea, not the easy routine they had arranged, but the tender emotional awakening that had happened within the darkness. A breakthrough that they both carried with care, now waiting for the next stage, the next connection, the next instant that might finally allow them to cross completely from private longing into something tangible and genuine. And Sarah experienced a quiet smile, sensing the bittersweet mixture of yearning and readiness, understanding that love had quietly entered their existence in a solitary night spent together in obscurity, and that its presence would continue, gentle yet undeniable, restructuring the way she perceived Marcus going forward. And the evening, though technically concluded, had metamorphosed into something monumental. It had become a turning point, a tender emotional bookmark that carried within it the assurance of what might still transpire. And she felt a heat that had nothing to do with the environmental temperature or the restored illumination, a heat generated entirely by acknowledgement, by possibility, and by the tender certainty that some things, once genuinely experienced, could never be completely forgotten, and that certain connections, once recognized, could never again be overlooked or minimized. And as she eventually prepared for rest that evening, her thoughts returned repeatedly to the darkness, to his hand finding hers, to the sound of his voice articulating truths previously kept secret. And she understood with absolute clarity that their story, the one they would construct together, had already commenced. It merely awaited their combined bravery to continue writing it, one genuine moment at a time.